world poetry, Munglong mysticism, and being a ghostie. Now, maybe you're thinking, I know what he's saying, but I didn't ken what he means. So if all that was Greek to you, don't worry, because this is a special episode with a special guest. We've got Brian Holton coming on this episode, who is he's an amazing translator of Chinese to English poetry, but he's also the premier, maybe the only translator of Chinese to Scots, and he's going to be talking to me about a poet who's all about world poetry, Munglong poetry, let's say, Munglong mysticism, and being a ghostie, being a ghost. We'll find out exactly what being a ghost means for the poet young Lian in my chat with Brian Holton. But before that, I'd like to talk a wee bit about the TrChFic news, the part of the show where I talk about what's new in the world of Chinese literature, or translated Chinese literature perhaps. So first news item is about sci-fi, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear. It's the author TrChFic, who was a guest on the episode of the show on his novel The Waste-Tide. Honestly, he keeps coming up. I end up talking about TrChFic a lot because he's a cool guy. And BBC World Service obviously have recognised the fact he's a cool guy, because he appeared just today actually on their show. So he'll be that little clip of him on the BBC World Service will be up for you guys to download and listen to online, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes as well. I'm not actually sure what he talked about yet because I've not listened to it, but I imagine it'll be something about ecological concerns, modern China, and what sci-fi's got to do with both of them. That's what I would expect, but I could be wrong. I have not found out yet, so find out for yourselves. See what TrChFic is talking about on the BBC. The wonderful BBC. Next news item. It's about a couple of female Chinese authors who are writing about, well, you know what's going on in Wuhan right now, but for future listeners listening in 2120, it's about the coronavirus lockdown that's been happening this year. So it's Yan Gerling, who is writing from Berlin, and Fang Fang, who is writing from Wuhan itself. And the reason I've got this in the news is because translations of what they've been writing are available. Yan Gerling's writing is... Oh, pause. Sorry, that was my coronavirus alarm. I've been infected and I'm going to die in a week, which means enough time to get this episode out. So Yan Gerling's writing is available on the Paper Republic site. Nikki Harman herself has translated it, so a link to that will be up in the show notes. And Fang Fang's writing is available in translation on Caixin, a very good website for all things about China, especially the news. So I'll link to both of those in the show notes, the episode description. And the last little news item is about wuxia, so genre fiction again. Wuxia being Chinese like kung fu fantasy. Think of us as Western consumers of pop culture. Think of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. That's wuxia. Now there's a guy who's probably the premier translator. I know I keep saying premier, but he's the top translator as far as I'm aware of Chinese wuxia. But on the internet, he's not really been involved with anything in print, but he's the online wuxia translator. His name, or his tag internet username is Deathblade, and I got this news via Deathblade's Twitter account, which funnily enough is at Deathblade. He's announced that I think the best online site, that's a bit of an oxymoron, the best website for reading translated wuxia online, Wuxia World, has launched an app for just for iPhones on the iOS store, the Apple Store. I don't have an iPhone, so I will not be downloading this app yet, but if wuxia is your thing and you have an iPhone, go get the Wuxia World app. If you like wuxia and aren't reading it online yet, go to the Wuxia World website and see if you can find what Deathblade and his contemporaries have been up to. You may know this if you're listening to this podcast, but some wuxia has been brought to print in translation recently, so if you'd rather read a physical book, please do go check out Jin Yong's, the translation of Jin Yong's series Legend of the Condor Heroes. I believe the second book is out now. Third one is on its way, I think. I've read the first one. It was very good. I can vouch for it. So yeah, that is the TrChFic news. Now, there's one more thing to do before we can zoom on to the interview with Brian Holton, and that's a little listener feedback section where we had some of the fans of the show, new listeners, more long-term listeners, although the show's not, I mean, the show's a year old now, so I suppose there are long-term listeners. But I'm just going to read out what they've been saying, what feedback they've been giving. And this goes without saying, but if you're listening and you'd like to give feedback, the show's got a Facebook presence, it's got a Twitter presence, an Instagram presence. These are all great places to get in touch with me, and I'll be giving information like the URLs and whatnot in the show notes, but I'll also give out like proper pointers for all that at the end of the show after the interview. So without further ado, let's hear what the listeners were saying. So I got a little comment about the name Jianguo, translation Build the Nation, and about those kind of red names. If you remember in the last episode on Moyan's Radish, me and my guest Lihaila were talking a little bit about that. So another former guest, also a lady from the USA, Michelle Dieter, gave some little comments about that on the podcast's Facebook page. So I'll just read what she said about that, because I think it's an interesting question to feedback, not just to me, but to you guys, the listeners, especially since I'm just one person, and this is really a question for readers in general. Bearing in mind, Michelle's a translator who's always looking for tips and feedback and whatnot. So here's what she says. So about people named Jianguo, I'm reading a book right now where one of the characters is named Build the Nation, Jianguo, and it's used to show that he's a stuffed shirt, part of the establishment. The character is top brass in the Public Security Bureau. But as your guest says, names are tricky. If I wanted to translate the book, how would I let the average reader enjoy that level of meaning? So I replied, well, as the podcast, this is what I said. As a reader, I'd be okay with a little footnote giving the characters behind the opinion and explaining their meaning. And then I said I wouldn't want like the character's name to be translated itself, like to something like if his surname was Chen, I wouldn't want him to be Chen Nation Builder. I just want him to be Chen Jianguo. And then maybe if a footnote told me what Jianguo meant, that'd be good. And then in the comment, I've continued on to say, if he's a stuffed shirt, his actions should show it. But a little footnote pointing to the meaning of the name would help emphasize that. But if you guys, if any translators are listening, and if any readers are listening, this is, I don't think this is strictly a question with an objective answer. I'm fairly convinced I'm right. But if anyone has other nuances that they want to bring up, or if anyone just straight up disagrees with me, please get in touch, because I'm only 90% convinced I'm right on that one. I don't necessarily think my word is law. Oh yeah, I've got another really nice piece of listener feedback. This is from an older listener. I don't know how old this listener is. I don't know if it's a man or a woman, but this listener has described himself as a senior citizen. And we had a little exchange on Twitter that started off talking about TrChFic, and I liked it so much. I think I'll read out a little bit of what this person said. So I only know their Twitter name, which is Steuerberaterin. Sorry, German listeners, but yeah, it's a German name, Steuerberaterin. Yes, and I was just talking with Steuerberaterin on Twitter, and this person said, I recommended your podcast and Clark's World to my fellow Chinese language students at Confucius Institute, a Confucius Institute somewhere in the German-speaking world, I guess. The 3 German-speaking countries. I think there's only 3. Germany, Austria, Switzerland. Anyway, let's stop waffling, keep reading this one tweet, which I'm still only halfway through. This is the tweet continuing, by the way. I am the senior citizen, in quotes, student in the class, and I have to promote reading and culture to the kids in quotes, smiley face. And I said, fantastic, keep spreading the word. And Steuerberaterin said, I will. My mantra is, I've always imagined that paradise will be a kind of library, but in real life, unfortunately, in quotes here, too many books, too little time. Your podcast is very helpful to find good books. Fantastic. One of my missions is to indeed just bring more attention to the individual books and translated Chinese fiction as a whole. But if it's serving like the more practical purpose of recommending things that people could seek out and read, fantastic. I always make a point, if it's something I've read online, I provide a link. If it's something that's just a more traditionally published book, I'll always talk about who the publishers are. So fantastic that it's helping at least one of you guys find interesting things to read. And again, if you want a recommendation, like, if you've got any questions about other things, please do ask me. I did have, not strictly a listener of the show, a friend of a friend asked me, he's like, recommend me a translated Chinese book. And I was like, you can just listen to the podcast, because he's not a listener. But yeah, if you want recommendations, all the episodes have discussions of books that could work as a little reading companion for you. But if you want to know more things, although I'm not an expert, I love to talk about this stuff. So yeah, one more little piece of feedback to go. So this is actually discussion not about any past episodes, but about this one, because I did a wee tweet saying that I was editing this episode and listening out to see whether, as I was talking to Brian Holton, if my own accent would double up. So one of our listeners, I think one name she goes by is YY, name on Twitter is codename Mama. I don't know why, but YY, aka codename : Mama, that is : the punctuation mark, not codename : Mama, said, it's just how we feel about our accents, i.e. that they change in situations. I try to speak in a relatively neutral mid-Atlantic accent, but when I speak to anyone from my country, which I think is Singapore, / a country where the native language isn't English, code switching is intuitive. So if any of you guys have any of your own experiences or thoughts about your voice changing either consciously or unconsciously given the situation, which I guess is what we call code switching, fantastic. I know that we have listeners of a fairly interesting range of backgrounds. I think my "oh gosh, I'm Scottish, sometimes I sound more Scottish, sometimes I sound less" is probably one of the least interesting out of all you guys' different instances where you might be code switching. So please, if you want to talk about that, do so. And you don't have to talk to me. There is a Facebook discussion group, and obviously Twitter is an open forum. So it doesn't have to be unidirectional, everyone running to me. If you want ways to talk to other fans, then, there are ways we can make it happen. Speaking of which, I have not yet made a Lian Instagram group chat, but once I'm done recording this episode, I'll make that. So by the time you're listening to this, if you would like to join a little chat about Lian, or indeed Brian Holton, I'll have made a group, or I'll have sought to make a group on Instagram for that. So contact the show's Instagram. Again, the username for that will be in the show notes. I'll tell you it now. TrChFic, TrChFic. I'll also name it. I'll also spell it again at the end of the show. Right, so that's all our listener feedback. We may as well charge on now and listen to my chat with Brian Holton. And it was a really good one. What a top guy. What a cheerful guy. I'm sure you'll enjoy everything he had to say. And the readings we did. You're going to hear some poetry from Chinese in Scots. So you've got that to look forward to.
5, 4, 3, 2, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Wu Se San Er Yi. I'm on the show with Brian Holton. Are you right, Brian? Fit likey?
Aye. Oh, just hanging there, read again.
Aye, good. And can you tell the listeners a wee bit about yourself?
Well, I was born in Galley Shields, to the polite map makers. And if you're born in Galley, the neighbours here for Selkirk and Hike and thereabouts will cry you a pale merk, because it's a matter of historical fact that Galley was the last of the border towns to get indoor plumbing.
Right.
So our neighbours reckon that we still got the merk of the pale on our arses.
That's terrible.
So I'm a prude pale merk. But my parents were living in Nigeria, so we lived in Lagos and then came home, lived in Edinburgh, Falkirk and in about Falkirk, and then back down to the borders when I was 13. So my accent is kind of... And my dad was Irish. My mother was for the borders, Galley and Wokerburn. Her family was Galley and Selkirk. So I'm a kind of mix Lothian and border when I'm speaking. And what else? I did a degree in Chinese. I was at Galley Academy doing classics, and the Hidi thought I should be a minister, but I was recused religious observance because I was brought up as a socialist.
Whoops.
And this man deeved the life out of me because he was some evangelical nut. He was removed a couple of years later. He was never allowed to be with Bairns again. But as a reaction against that, I saw Edinburgh was doing Chinese, and I discovered, shortly before, I discovered Arthur Whaley's translations in Pound. And I just thought, I'll do that. So I did that. And then I finished my postgraduate work just in time for Thatcher's experiment with the economy, and there were no jobs. Mm-hmm. So I was on the dole for a long time, and then on job creation, which is when I started publishing translations because I had the time.
Mm-hmm. I suppose people today might feel they're in a similar situation, people stuck in their homes who, depending on whether or not they can work from home, suddenly have time to be creative.
Well, yeah, this is it. I mean, this, the sort of late 70s, early 80s was a disaster economically, but benefits were a lot more generous then, and a lot of young people with time on their hands. I mean, look at the music, the literature, the stuff that boomed, the Irving Welsh generation, the punk movement, and also, of course, the home rule movement.
Right.
And magazines like St. Castus and Radical Scotland that changed our lives.
While we're talking about radicalism, so the wee intros and little mini bios about yourself and your career that I've read mentioned that you were interested in, or you chose to go and study Chinese, one, because you were already from a very multilingual kind of household, family house, and also that you'd come across Arthur Whaley's translations, were interested. But you also mentioned that you had a kind of like a socialist upbringing. So was the fact that China was, not a capitalist country, was that a source of interest for you, or was it that not really the draw?
It was when I started learning.
Right.
It was principally the classical stuff that interested me. Both, this must have been something for when my father and mother met. He was in the army in Galley Shields on an exercise, and his father and uncle, my great uncle, were engineers with the Ben Line, who sailed to the Far East. Right. And two of my mother's uncles, one by marriage, were engineers with the Ben Line who sailed to the Far East, and all four of them died in the flu epidemic 100 years ago, which must have been something for them to talk about. But the upshot was both grandparents' houses were full of stuff. I mean, at the moment, I'm looking at a couple of, on top of each of my loudspeakers for my hi-fi, I have a little, on the left, I have a little Japanese bronze figure, and the other a Chinese altar figure of a Lohan, kind of Buddhist saint, both of which were brought back by my Uncle Alec from the Far East. Amazing. So I grew up with this stuff. And of course, our house was full of African things. But despite having been surrounded by this, it had never occurred to me that Chinese folk wrote poetry.
Right.
It was like a shock when I found Whaley in the school library. I thought, what the hell is this? So I decided to do it.
This isn't really related to translated Chinese fiction at all, and it's just a little anecdote about myself that I don't think I've told on the show before that relates a little bit to your story. So I'm from Dundee, and Dundee, for listeners who don't know, its industrial past is very much linked to India and northeast India and Bengal because of the jute industry. So a little bit like yourself, I had a great grandfather who went out there to be something equivalent to your modern like Western expat. He was an engineer out training the Indian engineers to basically replace the Scottish engineers. And my grandpa, who passed away a few years ago, was there as a wee boy for a few years. So for a long time, this was just like a thing in theory. I knew about my granddad, that he had ridden on an elephant once. But I went via Kolkata for a few days when I went back to China one time. And it was maybe a similar experience to you, learning that this is a real place with real people who write real poetry. Sure enough, I visited this place and it was more than just a story about my granddad riding on an elephant when he was 7 or whatever.
Oh, no, I'd love to go back to Lagos. I still remember her address, 26 Point Road, Apapa, if anybody's listening. But, well, maybe one day. And what's your connection with Chinese?
Good question. when I finished my English literature degree, I didn't really have any like plans career-wise, but both my parents had mentioned like children of friends who had following uni gone off and done a year teaching in Asia. So I wasn't actually, people often, my Chinese friends in China would say, why did you choose China? And I had to say, well, sorry to disappoint you. I knew I wanted to go very far east, and the best job offer happened to be from a Chinese company. So that snowballed into living there for basically 3.5 years. Mostly, well, all working in schools, although 2.5 years of that, or 2 years of that, was in a school's writing center. So basically proofreading a lot of their stuff and doubling as a substitute teacher. So haven't really done any formal study, and my Mandarin is probably low intermediate or advanced beginner. I'm not really a language expert, but have become very interested in reading the literature and translation.
Yeah. But if you can order a beer and a bowl of noodles, you're doing fine. You know, I talk about it as noodle Chinese. It's very easy.
Oh yeah, noodle Chinese, taxi Chinese.
All the survival skills. Well, I used to attract students. I had a big poster at Newcastle. We used to do in Freshers Week. We used to have to attract students, and it said no tense, no number, no gender, no verb endings, no irregular verbs, no noun endings, no declension, no conjugation, no problem.
Yeah, that would. Yeah, I would usually rattle those things off if I'd met like a foreigner who was newly arrived and terrified. I was like, this language is actually not so hard, and I would gloss over the hard points and just talk about the easy bits.
Of course, I mean, reading and writing is a different matter. Learning to read, learning the characters isn't difficult, it's just slow. But your problem is, especially, I mean, it can happen at any point, but especially when you go into pre-modern stuff, then there's a way of thinking that is so different. And even on the street, you know, it's just a familiar thing to language learners. I ken what he's saying, but what the hell does he mean?
You
know, I used to, when I taught translation to Chinese students, I did a thing on idioms, a session on idioms, and I started by writing on the blackboard, away the messages. They knew all the words.
Right.
They knew every word, but they had no idea what it was about. Anyway, right.
Yeah.
Next question.
Questions. So we've talked a bit about yourself, and as we've seen, we probably could keep doing that for an ever and ever. But now I'd like to ask you some questions about your frequent long-haired collaborator and subject of this episode, young Lian. So first wee question has a little bit of a preface. So throughout the course of doing this podcast and talking to people online, generally speaking, listeners of the show, I've been recommended quite a few times by people whose judgment I trust very much that I should check out the Misty Poets. And one of those people is young Lian. He is, or was, depending on, I guess, I don't know, how you view things, a Misty Poet. So my question for you is kind of twofold. Who were / are the Misty Poets? And to what extent does young Lian fit in the mold of the archetypal Chinese Misty Poet?
Okay, these are a bunch of guys who in the late 70s started to write a new poetry. They were angry. They were this is after the Cultural Revolution, which was put an end to in 1976. Imagine people like Günter Grass in Germany having to learn to write German again without the Nazis. And like Grass said about the Nazis, that they had polluted the German language and we have to purify it again. So that's exactly how they felt. I don't know if some of them may have known about Günter Grass, but the idea was that the party had broken the Chinese language and they wanted to invent a new language that you could dream in, they said.
Right.
So highly abstruse poetry. Misty is a translation of the Chinese word Menglong. And Menglong is like, vague in the distance, in the haze over the sea, something will appear vaguely. So it's haze, vague. But it was used as a term of almost abuse by one of the official communist newspapers reviewing a volume of Menglong poetry.
Right.
And it wasn't called that then, but of young poets, and he called it Menglong, and they thought, yeah, that'll do that.
Thank you very much.
Exactly. Sabina Peschel in the 90s translated it. She suggested translating it as hermetic lyricism, which is quite good. because the point was it was lyrical poetry, and it wasn't, there's none of the socialist realist stuff. About the heroic workers and great harvests and building tractors, which had gone before in the 50s and 60s. It was about expressing the inner self, but because the inner self is not, it's not public. It can only be expressed in terms of hermetic, in the sense that they're only understood by the subconsciously, if you like, or internally.
Right.
So hermetic lyricism. They were making a new voice. They wanted a new language to dream in. So, I mean, people like, what makes Yang Lian different is, I mean, he was the baby of the family. He was very much, the other guys were older than him.
Right.
Bei Dao, for instance, has moved, it was always a bit more autobiographical, and his poetry became kind of more smaller, more private, and he turned to writing autobiographies and stuff. I mean, he's still working and he's a major poet, but guys like Man Ke, who were really profoundly important, Man Ke stopped writing poetry for many years. And then the major woman was Shu Ting. They were mostly guys. Gu Trung, of course, killed himself and his wife. He was not a well boy.
No.
I met him in London once, and he clearly was. So anyway, so apart from Bei Dao, most of them have fallen away from poetry. But then this happens a lot. Many poets stop writing in middle age, don't they? It's sort of thing like punk music that you do when you're young.
Right. And
they were very much like punks. Had they been allowed, these guys could have filled football stadiums. Of course, they were never allowed to. When I went to China first in '88, I mean, these guys were like rock stars. And still, when Yang and I are doing readings, there are Chinese ladies of a certain age who gather groupies, when I was a student, But I think one of the differences is he's kept on writing and kept on developing, and his poetry is getting larger and larger in many respects. We have a mutual friend, the Dutch poet Arjen Denker, who does a wonderful imitation of Yang Lian. We must go deeper. And this, so Yang is unlike the Misty poets in that he's trying to act as a bridge between classical culture and the modern sensibility. That's one of his
panning out rather than panning in, sort of a thing.
Well, going deeper,
right?
Yeah. But yes, you could say that. Yes. That'd be a good way of doing it. Yeah. It's like, this is not quite relevant, but it's a great story. After I came back from my year in China, after Tiananmen, it was Circuit Common Riding Week. I was living in Circuit at the time, and there was a heat wave, and it was scary. When you first come back, that first few days of culture shock, all these pink people with yellow hair and stuff.
I came back during a heat wave myself. Actually, it was nice because I was worried I was going to lose Chinese summer, and I didn't.
That's right. But anyway, I bumped into somebody, a Kenter, since we were teenagers, and she says, "Oh, I hadn't seen you for a while." I said, "Have you been away?" I says, "I said, I've been in China." "Oh," she says, "we were in Edinburgh last week," which is, Well, it's two things. It's one is the small town. It's binary. It's here and no here.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, she has such a deep root in Selkirk.
Right.
Me, I was born in Galley, but I lived in Lagos and I lived in Edinburgh. And as an adult, I've lived in England and China and Hong Kong. It's going wide and going deep. Both are necessary.
Right. Yeah.
Yang is trying to go very deep in order to go wide. The modern consumer society, the modern world we live in, has thrown the baby out with the bathwater, especially in China, where pre-modern culture, not well before the Communist Party, it started 100 years ago with the end of empire, that it was Chinese culture that kept China backward, was the idea, and that China should adopt Western culture wholesale. And Yang is trying to, he's not alone, younger poets are doing it too, but he's trying to sort of, what's the French word, reculer pour mieux sauter, to step back to jump further.
I refer to this episode a lot, but the very first episode of the podcast is on Lu Xun and his Diary of a Madman. And as much as I like Lu Xun, and the only other writer of the new culture movement I've read is Ding Ling, who also got an episode on. But as much as I think these guys are really awesome, and I can I feel like the whole mission of saving the country is one that resonates with me. But the more I read about them, the more you hear people of the mind that the new culture movement, which is that kind of pro-Westernization, save the country movement, in some ways has a lot to answer for. And I'm sure that's probably Yang Lian's point of view.
Yes, I mean, if you think about Victorian attitudes in Scotland to Gaelic and to Scots,
right?
Know, they have to be extirpated in order to be, choose your adjective, progressive, modern, Christian, whatever,
Yeah.
So Yang and I are in deep agreement with that. And also, my twin brother Harvey, who was writer in residence at Duncan and Jordanston for a few years.
Oh, right. It's the art school in Dundee, by the way, guys who are listening, which is where I'm from.
That's right. Well, he stayed just at the other side of the Tay. If it wasn't for a stand of trees, you could actually see from his house near the Galway. You can actually see Dundee, except there's a stand of trees in between.
Oh, that's annoying.
I'm
in Fife right now, actually. Again, for listeners, the bit on the other side of the river from Dundee. I'm just on the road to St Andrews in Edenside.
Edenside, I can now. My first wife is from St Andrews. So,
all right.
I've got Fife connection. My twin brother spent most of his life in Fife there. But he and Yang were great pals. And from both of us, Yang got this. It was a major change. That article that you were going to talk about later, talking about how Yang's poetry changed. I think one change that was major for him after exile was actually meeting my brother.
Oh, right.
So Harvey took him to see Macbeth's castle, and that made a profound impression on him.
Fantastic.
And he and Harvey were very close. So, we because we all have a joint project, which is digging back to go forward. We can't let Scots die.
Right.
And Harvey was about that, and also his kind of his ideas about reviving pagan culture, and Yang going back to the classical heritage and integrated it into the modern. We're all doing the same thing.
That's fantastic. There was something that popped up when you were talking a little bit earlier about the period Yang and the Misty Poets were writing in, and how they were angry men, and that made me think back to what you said when you got into I guess translating when Margaret Thatcher was having her wee experiment in the late 70s. So it's just funny to think that different sides of the world, you guys didn't know about each other. Societies were going through very different moments, but at the same time there were some parallels in the tracks.
Let me give you a German word: Zeitgeist.
Yeah.
The spirit of the times. Astrologers will have more complex explanations as well. But So with Dr. Jung.
Yep, synchronicity.
That.
Yeah, I was talking about I don't know if the word synchronicity came up, but the episode before this one, I was talking about the world of the weird with the big W, which I think is very big on that stuff. The other thing that popped into my head when you were talking about the damage, so to speak, done to the Chinese language by the party. There is another podcast, technically it's my rival, what is it called? The Chinese Literature Podcast. And they've got some episodes on the kind of poetry that was being promoted by the government or whatever at that time. And there's an episode I've listened to a few times. It's called Ode to a Dumpster Truck. And it is a poetryless poem just praising dumpster trucks, which I don't know, I like as an idea, but they were pretty convinced that it was a very bad poem, and I'll take their word for it.
Well, it could be a good idea and a bad poem, or there are many too. My grandfather was a socialist, my mother's father. He was a blacksmith for Duns, and he went to the First War and learned about grand opera, socialism, and the internal combustion engine, and that. These three defined his life. But he used to say to me, socialism isn't about tractors, son. Socialism is about sleeping in the sun.
There you go. Amen. I like that very much.
Next question. Yeah. Before we start reciting the Communist Manifesto. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about Yang Lian's kind of
his persona and his artistic project, or whatever you want to call it. But I think I noticed watching some readings he was doing on YouTube, or listening to the audio of the readings and then playing video games so that I wouldn't get bored. Not that he's boring, I just couldn't really sit and watch someone reading a poem online for 2 hours. But anyway, I've heard him talk a lot, that's what I'm trying to say, and he's fantastic to listen to, and he seems very upbeat. But when I was reading Narrative Poem, which is the book / very long poem that is the text subject to this episode, I was noticing it's very dark in a lot of points, and the cover art that's been picked is a painting by Gao Xingjian, who's a Nobel Prize winner, if I remember correctly. That's also a very dark painting. It's quite unluminescent, and I'd say, from what I recall of my reading of your translations of Yang's narrative poem, it's pretty murky itself, and yet he seems to be a very cheerful dude. So do words like optimist and pessimist apply to Yang Lian's work at all, or is that kind of not a helpful frame to be looking at?
Well, I had a different answer in my mind, but as you were speaking, I thought of the Tai Chi tool, the diagram, the yin-yang diagram.
Mm-hmm.
And, classically in pre-modern China, optimism is an extreme, pessimism is an extreme, and you don't want an extreme. You want a balance. You want to reflect both sides. So the fully realized human is both optimistic and pessimistic, and neither, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, of course.
It's a philosophical stance that goes way back to early China, long before Buddhism.
Oh, you've cut out. Are you going to come back? Going to pause the recording.
The fact that the poetry is about the universe becoming conscious of itself.
You cut out for about maybe 30 seconds, and I should have taken a mental note what the last thing he said was.
Well, let's go back to the Tai Chi tool, the yin-yang diagram.
Thank you.
And a thing that goes way back to native Taoism, before the arrival of Buddhism, is the notion of being part of nature, and nature can only express itself. The cosmos can only speak through humans, because we're the only part of the universe that has language.
Right.
So the function of poetry is for the cosmos to speak to itself. And luminescence and its opposite are both important, because that's part of the whole show. So you have to, as Yang Lian said, we must go deeper. We must become larger. We must contain multitudes. He was very influenced by Yeats, and he's looking for a kind of mature wisdom here.
Right. I'd never thought I knew about the kind of quote unquote Eastern way of thinking about binaries being part of the same thing. I read, when I was starting to learn about the world of learning beyond school in my last year of high school, I picked up The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and it's a very big book, small print, small gaps between the lines. But one bit that jumped out, mostly the experience of reading it, was little sections jumping out at me. And there was a bit where he talked about the difference between Western binary thinking and the kind of yin-yang model from China and Asia. And I thought, this makes so much sense. This is common sense, actually. And despite having thought I'd absorbed that, I'd never applied it to optimism and pessimism. But that probably describes how most people operate, regardless of what they call themselves.
There's also another issue there with regard to time. What the Arabs call, or the Muslims call, al-Kitab, the people of the book, which is to say the Judeo-Christian traditions and the Muslims. They all see time as having a beginning and an end. God created the world will run until God ends it. Time is linear. Now, time is not linear in other cultures, particularly since we're speaking of China. It's more like a spiral, so that you may spiral between optimism and pessimism. It also maps neatly onto Hegel's dialectics, thesis, antithesis, higher synthesis, which produces an antithesis, and so on. So there's all sorts of stuff that Yang was steeped in. As a child, his father gave him a wonderful education. Yang never went to university. Universities were shut when he was that age.
Right.
So he was kind of homeschooled by his dad in a way. And he has an immense knowledge of classical literature and classical thinking. So that is relevant here when he's going back into the imperial age and the pre-modern thinking. He's also going back into his own childhood,
cool.
Which is what gives it power, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's relevant to narrative poem, going back into childhood.
It is, yes, indeed, yeah. Next question.
Yes. So this one we've touched on a wee bit when you talked about your friend, you and your brother Harvey's friendship with young Lian, how you kind of introduced him to Scots or Scotland, and it's the quest to kind of bring back or preserve its native culture or language or what have you. I just wonder specifically, did yourself or Harvey teach any Scots to young Lian over the years? Do you know if he's got any favourite Scots phrases or terms or words? No, we didn't even try. When I first started working with him, I got a phone call. He'd been at a conference in Berlin, and I'd done 2 or 3 of his poems for a magazine or for an anthology. And the editor had showed them to Yang, who had no English to speak of, and Yang had shown them to some American poets, and compared them with other people's translations. And the American poets had said mine was the best. So Yang was living in Sydney, and he phoned me up. I was teaching, you know. The secretary came and said, "There's an urgent phone call." So I had to leave a class, and I thought somebody must have died. But there's this Beijing voice saying, you know, with that Beijing back in the throat voice. You know? And he said, basically, I haven't got much time. He said, I'm flying back to Australia, but would you like to translate my collected shorter poems? So, well, I mean, what would you say? Yeah, exactly.
I said, fine. So we actually corresponded. We didn't meet for nearly 3 years. And then he said very little English. But that year I took him up to Harvey. We went for a long drive. Harvey was in Dumfries and Galloway. And, you know, it was a bit stiff, the first bottle. By the time the second bottle came, the poets were ignoring the rest of the people. And they were deep into things like metre and rhyme. And Harvey taught Yang how he could use rhyme. Because Yang had thought rhyme was cliched, hackneyed, nothing to do with him. That was old stuff. But Harvey showed him how he could use it. And Yang has been using rhyme more and more, which is, as you can imagine, a real problem for me.
Right, because he's rhyming in Mandarin.
Yes, which rhymes very easily, very fecund. It's like Italian, you know. So no, I haven't bothered with Scots yet. But Yang has absorbed ideas. You know, I mean, when I first met him, he knew MacDiarmid and Sorley MacLean. Hugh MacDiarmid and Sorley MacLean had been translated into Chinese because they were communists.
Right.
So, and in fact, on a raised beach. Is it on a raised beach? Yes, that was an influence on one of his poems. In the first book we did, Sky Burial, about, you know, the Tibetan habit of leaving bodies out to decay. As stones dream of these names, you know, and he talks about names melting like snow across the stones. Imagining stones of consciousness and we so fleeting, which is taken directly from MacDiarmid's poem on a raised beach, which he admits. So there has been some influence. Next question. Let's get this going.
Marching swiftly on. Yeah. So that's all the questions about young Lian, and we've kind of caught a few glimpses as we've been talking of narrative poem. His great big poem / book that is our book for this episode. I think you mentioned a little essay that is in my little list of questions that I read as prep. It was quite an interesting one, and it was a critical one, although I'm going to leave out the critical points and just give you just read to the listeners the name of this essay, which is available for free online. I'll put a link in the show notes for listeners. It's called Young Lian's Exilic Poetry, World Poetry, Ghost Poetics, and Self-Dramatization. So just going off the title, we've got quite a lot of ways we could describe what narrative poem is or is not. So my question for you is, what does it have to do with, if anything, with exiledom, in little quotes, world poetry, being a ghost, which is not in quotes, and the dramatization of one's life? What's it got to do with those things? Or are they...
Well, how much time do we have? There's several PhDs in there.
Well, time is a spiral. So.
Well, there we are. Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to make a joke about deja vu, but
do it.
No, I've forgotten it already.
Oh, okay.
I thought it was an interesting little essay, and I don't disagree with it, although it is very critical.
Yeah.
But I mean, these are themes that are very important for Yang. The exile thing, that was one of the most important things to happen in his life. But he'd already been exiled before in an internal psychological sense. His family, his great-grandfather, for instance, was a moneylender to Manchu princes. And the family owned, don't know, well, Beijing, but Wang Fujing, it's the Beijing equivalent of Oxford Street. His family owned that.
Right.
Because they lent money to the Manchu princes to buy opium, and when the Manchu princes had no more money, they repossessed their property. So that was what Yang's family was. His grandmother was a Mongol princess.
Gosh.
So, he's aristocracy. Well, he's not actually. He's rich, from a very rich family. But his parents were enthusiasts for the revolution, and they gave away all the property to the party.
Right.
Or they gave away a lot of the personal property. The party, of course, expropriated much of the land and the houses and the property and so on. So he's in exile from that background. All Chinese of my age, who were young. Well, I was born the same year as the Chinese Revolution. So we're exiles in Yang's sense. We're exiles from imperial culture. He was exiled, as a child growing up in a family which was, especially as his teenage years, his father had a huge collection of classical music and a very, very classy radiogram. So he was surrounded by classical music. His particularly romantic stuff, Beethoven, and also so that made him an exile from his classmates. And then in his teenage years, he was sent down to the countryside. This vast movement that Mao started. So he was exiled from his home, from his parents, from his friends, and sent to dig graves in a remote mountain village, a long way from Beijing, closer to Xi'an.
Gosh.
So he. When Tiananmen happened in 1989, he was on a trip he was visiting New Zealand for a year. John Minford, the great English translator John Minford, who was then Professor of Chinese at Auckland University, invited Yang. The two had met when Minford was first in China in the mid-early 80s. So, they've known each other for a long time. But so Yang was there. And then he and Gutrun and Minford organised a memorial to the dead of Tiananmen, which meant he was immediately persona non grata. He could not go home.
Did the news travel very fast?
Yeah, but, I mean, for many years he could go home because he had a New Zealand passport, and it said, it didn't have the characters for his name. So when he was filling in the entry forms, he just used different characters, a different Yang and a different Lian. And that worked for a long time. By the time the Chinese government had their computers up and running, he was no longer persona non grata.
Huh.
He was on a blacklist for a while. But by the time he moved to London, which would be mid-late 90s, he met somebody in the embassy who said, no, you're not on the blacklist anymore.
There you
go. But exile is one of the really, really important things, personally, in his daily life. Having to learn to live he's lived in New Zealand, Australia, London. Now he lives in Berlin now, and he's travelled all over the world. But it's also one of his great themes. And in a way, you would almost say, looking at his poetry and his thinking, that the exile was necessary. It was already there in the egg, as it were.
Right. Yeah.
And the actual fact of moving away. World poetry, of course, is a very important thing, because had it not been for the interest in the 80s and 90s in world poetry, in fact, the invention of the concept, then Yang couldn't have done what he's done. As a ghost, well, that's another of his big themes.
Right, it's not just this book.
No. I still haven't sorted out. It's an idea of so much resonance, and it runs through the whole idea. That it runs through all these books. It's partly to do with this exile, that as a ghost from the other life looks back. So we alienated moderns, looking back at the riches of old China, we're like ghosts, and that we can no longer participate in the full richness of life. So the ghost is the eternal observer, the outsider.
Right.
which is also the poet's function. I mean, he models himself on Qu Yuan, the great, the guy who, the poet, the first named poet in China, who drowned himself as a rebuke to his ruler, which is where the Dragon Boat Festival comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Qu Yuan is, it's in English, the Songs of the South,
Right.
Translated by David Hawkes, truths. So this idea of the poet as the eternal outsider, speaking truth to a world that doesn't necessarily care to listen. That's part of the ghost thing as well. So these complex things of exile, being a ghost, Qu Yuan, they're all tied up together. Mm-hmm. And, the dramatization of life, well, what else does a poet do? Come on.
Yes, that is true. I wonder...
Although I suppose, having said that, that's a very Western concept. Wordsworth's concept of the poet as a man speaking to other men. Now, that doesn't happen in traditional Chinese culture because poetry doesn't come out, although there are some early shamanic things, but poetry doesn't come out of things like the divine inspiration in Greece and Rome, where the god speaks through the poet.
So this is maybe more a pointer for the listeners. The only other episode... No, I've done 2 other episodes on poetry, although one, I'm not sure if it's strictly poetry. One's on Lu Xun's Ye Cao, Wild Grass, aka Weeds. And there's one which is on more, it's definitely poetry. It's called The Wild Great Wall by Zhu. And Zhu is also, he's not strictly speaking in exile, but his poetry deals with themes of exile. So I guess if listeners like young Lian, Zhu might be a guy to look out for who writes on some similar themes. But yeah, now that that's off my mind, let's go to the next question, which is, of all things, about the contents page of Narrative Poem. Because when I opened up the book, obviously that's one of the first things I see. And I can tell there's a lot of, at least in the way it's ordered, there's a lot of structure to this book, because it's not just a bilingual contents page. It's got a preface, part 1. Within part 1, there's photograph album 1. Within photograph album 1, there's canto 1, and then that repeats. Then there's a part 2, which is just as intricately structured. And yeah, so without me describing the entire contents page, I could just tell there was an intricate structure going on here, and I just wanted to ask you why you think that is.
Well, all his work is like that. I mean, when I first started translating him, I have to say I didn't understand him, but I used to say to people, what I translate what he says, what he means is his problem. But slowly I began to realize, I've written about this, that a lot of his poem, it's like mosaic, the little tessera of images that come together to form a much bigger image. And it's very carefully structured. But in the case of Narrative Poem, the Chinese edition has the photographs. The real photograph album.
Right.
But he wasn't able to provide them in time when the book went to press. I don't know why. That's between him and the publisher. I wasn't part of the discussion.
Right.
The publisher didn't get them anyway. I don't know why.
Didn't happen. Right.
But they're genuine photographs, and it's actually quite moving in the Chinese to see the original. So when he's describing in these sections, for instance, photograph album, just flicking through it. They were first day.
What's the page number?
Page 37.
37, thank you.
Yeah. So the little beast sleeps on its side. I mean, this is a photograph of the newborn Yang sleeping on his side. And it's actually the white mittens, the cot, the snow. He was born in Switzerland, where it was very snowy. His father was a diplomat. Right. So, it's actually what seems at first abstract. There was a moment of epiphany many years ago, not that many years ago, maybe 20 years ago. Yang and I were at a conference in Auckland, a wonderful week-long conference on poets in exile, which was dominated by poets and writers rather than by the parasitic academics who write about poets and writers.
Critics,
Critics, yeah.
Podcasters.
Yeah, well... yeah. Okay, I mean, that's second order. So this one dominated by first order discussions. Mm-hmm. And at one point, the organizer took us out to his bach, his little out-of-town cottage, and Yang came Yang was a bit ahead of me. He went in the house first. I'm talking to somebody. He ran back and said, come here, look at this. And it was at the head of a valley. And as you look down on the skyline, you look down to a perfect V of 90 degrees, beyond which was the sea. The hills sloped down green and the sea was that. And he said, look, that's the beginning of where the sea stands still. Blue is always higher. Now, I just assumed this was an abstract. But no, when you stand by the sea and you look at the sea, it does appear to rise. The curvature of the earth and that. And that was when I thought, oh, wait a minute. It's like he's taking lots of wee snapshots and collaging them together. And that's the same with the structure. Many of his books are like narrative poem, and Where the Sea Stands Still and Anniversary Snow. They're concentric circles. They're full-length, they're book-length poems.
Right.
In his thinking.
Got it.
So yes, it's structured. And I'm going to read you Peking Opera Lesson.
Okay.
Which is definitely my favourite.
Fantastic.
And there are lots of references to the theatres which were all owned by his family. His father is an aficionado of both Western opera and Peking opera. I'm not going to read it in Chinese because my accent is awful.
Okay, fair enough.
It's Jingju Ke. It's Peking opera, Jingju.
Jingju Ke.
Peking Opera Lesson. And these are images of, you have to imagine the Peking Opera stage. If you've ever been to the Summer Palace on the fringes of Beijing,
I took my mum
beautiful stage. Well, there's a lovely stage there. Imagine that. And of course, there's also underlying it, there's a lot of flower stuff, which is because in classical Chinese, hua, meaning a flower, could also mean a beautiful girl. So, Peking Opera Lesson. Peonies cluster round. On their fine stamens stand pergola and patio. Her cheek transits over to him, a dream half white, half red. His sweet tenderness becomes her springtime soprano. Ist man, ist ghost. An impossible beauty dallies with the world beyond. Dalliance approaching. Powder's perfume shores up the aroma of flesh. Hip-swinging, high buskins wade the riffling pool and see it overflow. He sings, and she puts her signature to each drawn-out end rhyme. Life is like theatre, but not everyone puts on a brilliant show, says father. Eastern Peace Market, Fortuna Theatre, Goldfish Lane, all chasing the king's concubine. Clouds want clothes, flowers want faces, history wants broken down relics that follow after grease paint is gone. He and she, amorous looks and sweet ogling fill in the blank storyline. White silk sleeves have been rippling a millennium. Who cares about dry names? The shot glass is filled up all unseen, is knocked back all unseen. The snapped neck hanging from the strap in a darkened private party pirouettes. A true cut flower has encountered a true maturity, says father. A world hidden in air materializes with the crane's cries. Oh, dynasties! The crimson and the white are bliss indeed. An aria forced from deep in the throat forces out deep time's metamorphoses. Always the same story. Always this girl and this boy, treading the margin of the stage as if it were the margin of time, treading the knife edge of the now. The oceans below the cliff recede. She and he watch us from a great height, the only extreme elegance allowed. Oh, how golden shines art's alembic. It pierces every silence in the ears, says father. And there you are.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that.
Well, I've done it before.
Right. I just want to say one thing before we skip on past narrative poem. It was really interesting finding out that there were pictures to each of these little descriptions of the pictures, I suppose. This is one for, again, maybe more for the listeners, anyone who's followed me on Twitter or doesn't follow me on Twitter yet. I took a picture of the front cover narrative poem and was going to write some clever comment, but instead I just put another picture up next to it, which is a meme, one of these funny pictures from the internet, and it's a guy whose face has been distorted in like a fisheye effect, so he's leaning in and frowning and going, it's the main character from the TV show The Witcher, and he just looks totally befuddled, and it looks like he's looking at narrative poem. And I thought, is anyone going to get this little joke? It seems completely obscure and silly. But I got a reply from a Scots Chinese poet called J.G. Ying, who's on Twitter quite a lot.
Yes. I've met Jay.
Right.
He's good. Yeah, he's a good guy.
Well, what did he say? He said something like, where is it? Click, 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 click. He said, "This made me laugh. I know what you mean." So I must have been onto something.
Yeah. I should say, by the way, that Gao Xingjian and Yang have been friends for many years, and Yang chooses the covers for the books, not me.
Right. It is a very nice cover, and the red text goes nicely on the kind of murky green paint. Anyway, let's march on.
Let us.
Yes. Let's wander away a wee bit from purely Chinese to English translation, which is what pretty much every episode of the show, except the one I did on the Moss Flow, has been about, and towards a tongue that you and I might call one of our own, but which most of those listening to us would not, and that's obviously Scots. So the reason we're doing this show is you listened, or you caught word of the episode on the Moss Flow, and you emailed me, and you said a few nice things, and you also said your Scots leaves a little bit to be desired, which is definitely true, especially my readings of the Moss Flow. But I'm just curious, apart from me botching some of the Scots words, is there anything else about the Moss Flow that I just completely missed or got wrong that you'd like to kind of comment on?
Well, it's the Moss Flow.
Oh, of course. Moss Flow. Obviously. I mean, I don't like this idea about botching. Right. You were working out of well, obviously, I wasn't taught Scots. Right.
I wasn't taught to read and write in Scots until my third year at high school, where I had Gallifield's Academy. Donald McInnes was probably the only teacher in Scotland who was making us read Scots for our hire, as well as of course, I missed the first 2 years. I was at school in Falkirk or in Larbert, so I didn't get the Walter Scott. They were pumped full of Walter Scott for 2 years. But then for hire, we read from the Makars, the great medieval poets like Henryson Dunbar, right up to poets who were still living, like Hugh McDermott.
Right.
And it was a wonderful education. But I had to teach myself because in Scotland, people outside that don't realise this probably, we are illiterate in our mother tongue. 70% of people in lowland Scotland speak Scots, but very, very few of them read and write it. We are taught to read and write in a foreign language, in English. Mm-hmm. Now, when you, I just yesterday replied to a friend, a translator, who posted something, a very interesting story about one teacher who succeeded in preserving the Tibetan language across the area, and a whole area of Tibet where the Chinese in the 50s, 60s were trying to stamp it out, which they're still trying to do. And I said, well, this is what happens when you're a minority language speaker, but we never see Scots on television, certainly if you're a borderer. The only Scots you see is in comedy programmes, and they're all from Glasgow, or occasionally Dundee. Right. So, our voice is not heard. So I'm not going to say you botch things because you're from Dundee. It's a different dialect. There are, depending how you count, 6 or 7 dialects of Scots.
Yeah.
From the Northern Isles to Northern Ireland. And I speak Southern Scots, which is no the same again.
Right.
I'm going down the twice. I've gone home. And what would you say in Dundee? You're gone home.
Gone home. Aye. Yeah, gone home. Yeah.
Aye. Could you do a pie? And usually El Happy.
Oh, is this about pies?
Yes.
Okay, we have a very good one in Dundee. So pi is a pe, and
El
one.
Jefe.
Well, what el pe, yeah. But also, if you want to really go for it and get some poetic rhyming, trois pes and ingana, which means
Oh,
2 pies and an onion roll as well, please.
and then no. Well, you
Ingana.
know, St Andrew's wonderful album from the 90s, The Word on the Pavey.
I don't.
Oh, listen, this guy who's a lecturer in Duncan Jordanson.
Right.
He performs as St Andrew, and the music was Michael Mara did the music. You get things like hip hop and Dundee dialect.
Oh my goodness.
Well, I bet the chorus is, well, I better chap a plane in and an ing and an ah.
Yeah, that could sound good to a beat.
And the heavenly chorus, if you think Walk on the Wild Side, Lou Reed, and the chorus of female voices comes in. Oh, you need to ken about this boy. His second album has The Secret Commonwealth of Elvis fans on it.
Oh.
And it is broad. There's whiles I have trouble understanding them.
There's a weird thing.
The word on the pavey.
Yeah, I wonder. So this is rambling a bit too much. I'll tell us as concisely as I can. Me and my girlfriend were getting the bus back from St Andrew, back from Dundee city centre to Broughty Ferry, which is the suburb of Dundee I'm from. And there was a guy, speaking of the secret commonwealth of Elvis fans, there was a guy sat at the front of the top deck of the bus who had, I think he was like in an audio, what would you call it? Like he was on a call on his phone and he had his headphones in and was talking to his microphone. And he was singing Elvis. Because at first we thought he was singing to himself, but he was like, between songs, he was chatting to some other people who, from what we gleaned, might be singing along with him. So I wonder if that was a member of the Secret Commonwealth operating in Dundee.
Well, you never can.
Synchronicity. Anyway, back to Chinese things.
Well, I mean, just a very quick story. When I started doing the Mossflower, I fell in love with the book when I was a student, and I tried to translate it in English, and I couldn't make it work. And my first wife, she said to me, "Look, you spent years reading in Scots. Try it in Scots." I said, "Well, I can't. I'd never written in Scots." But then I sat down, and the first thing just fell off the page. I amazed myself. I didn't ken I could do that. So we have passive knowledge, and it's about language learning. You have to learn your own language.
Right.
The mother tongue, or reduced to just a passive thing, except in certain contexts.
Right, exactly.
If you're in the pub or at a football match or talking to your granny or whatever. Right. So moving on. Okay.
Quick thing I'll say to that, then I will move on. I won't give you a chance to reply. So I was before we hit record, I was talking a wee bit about doing some like work experience editing of books in Scots, and I found the text I was given, I could read it all fine, but one of my jobs was, I thought, to like standardize the spelling, which required an awful lot of thought because I didn't really know what the spellings were. And the conclusion I came to is there are many ways I could spell this. I'm just going to come up with my own spelling grid. Then I asked some other proper publishers, 404 Inc., who've done, amongst other things, they did Chris McQueer, who's like a young kind of Irving Welsh sort of figure. I asked him, and then I asked the publishers, like, how did you guys standardize the spellings? And the publisher said, we didn't, you don't standardize Scots. And Chris McQueer said, well, I had help with an editor. And I said, oh, was your editor a Scots editor? He's like, no, he's an English guy. He was really helpful, though. He gave me some great writing feedback. So all these things I just had never considered, because although I'd been taught to read Burns and whatnot in school, actually writing it, no, not at all.
Not at all.
No. Right, marching on. So you've said before that getting to write, well, you said a minute ago, that your way to translate the Mossflower, which if anyone who didn't listen to that episode is wondering, it's a Scots translation of water margin, Shwe Hudron. Your way of doing that was using Scots. And I've got a book of your translations called Ston in Malane, which is kind of like a trilingual book of Scots, English and Chinese ancient poems. And it says in there, I think in your preface or your afterword, the English is there as a reference. The real thing that you're buying the book for, so to speak, is the Scots. So I want to ask you, what is for you the affinity between Chinese, be it modern or ancient, and Scots? Or if this is a more helpful way to phrase the question, what can Chinese to Scots, C to S, do that Chinese to English, C to E, can't?
Well, just in everything else, if you ask a translator a question, the answer is usually it depends.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, as native speakers for us, the Scots has echoes and resonances that it doesn't for others. But then you see the Chinese has echoes and resonances for Chinese speakers.
Right.
So it's hard. It's an unconscious thing. But for me, the Scots has got power. It has energy. Kafka said that for him, as a Jew, German was always somebody else's language. And when I started to write in Scots, it was so liberating because I suddenly realised this is my language. It's my own tongue. It was my mother tongue. It was my mother's tongue, my granny's tongue, and all the rest of it. And we're speaking to ourselves. An international audience is wonderful. That's great. And I can speak English for international purposes. But there's a large part of us that we didn't get to talk to each other because the mass media we can't hear Scots on the media. Yeah. So I have to use this. And it liberates me. I love the music of it. It's a different music to English. It's rhythmically different. They're grammatically different. Scots and English are, like maybe Spanish and Portuguese, or Norwegian and Danish, right, or Mandarin and Cantonese. Historically, Scots is a West Germanic language like English.
Right.
But English came from the Midland dialect of Anglo-Saxon and Scots from the Northern dialect. Mm-hmm. So they're historically related, but they're not the same. One is not a dialect of the other. They're both dialects of Anglo-Saxon.
Right. That's a definition I've come across, I think, maybe because a person is explaining to me and not a paragraph online.
Well, maybe. But there isn't a big universal one-size-fits-all answer to the question, what can Scots do that English can't?
Right.
Because it depends on the communication. If there isn't a speaker and a listener, or a writer and a reader, then that you don't get that circuit, like an electrical circuit closing and sparking up. It's about interaction. And I mean, I've had such a lot of positive feedback from that book, Stan in Malane. Folk just love it. It opened up something in myself. And also, particularly, I mean, you've chosen to talk about one poem by Li Bai,
right,
which in Chinese is called Jiang Jin Jiu.
Jiang Jin Jiu, right.
Alliteration, you notice? Now, when in his day in the 8th century, it was probably pronounced something like Jiang Jin Jiu, as far as we can tell, but it still alliterates. Now, in Scots, we have the wonderful adverb ben. Now, jiang means take or bring, jin means into or in, jiu is alcohol. So, bring the bevy ben. Jiang, bring, jin, ben. Bring ben bevy would be even more. Why didn't I think of that? Bring ben bevy. It's like, if you're an artist and you move from oils to acrylics, there are some effects you can get in one that you can't get in others. Mm-hmm. Or, if you transcribe a Bach lute piece for the piano, it's the same thing. The notes are the same. That's translation. The images are the same, but the words are different.
Yeah.
And hopefully the emotional engineering that goes behind it works. And Li Bai was very colloquial. He liked ballad forms, old-fashioned forms. He wasn't a great innovator in form. Mm-hmm. Would you like to hear it? That
would be lovely. I was trying to think of another metaphor about what you're saying about how the same thing can come out in different ways. And my idiot brain could only come up with, if you put different color codes through different printers, you get slightly different shades of color. But I think that's actually a terrible metaphor.
That's not bad. I tell you what, piece of advice, go to the preface to the King James Bible, the 1610 preface.
Yeah.
A wonderful passage there. Translation it is, which draweth back the curtain and letteth in the light, something like that. That opens the shell that we may eat the nut. There's a whole series of metaphors. You'd like that.
Fantastic. So I was wondering if we could get some kind of reading of two of these three languages that bring the bevy bends in. I was wondering, would you like to do the Scots and I could do the English parallel by some means?
Certainly. I thought I would begin by reading the first part of it in Chinese, just the first few lines, just to get a feeling for the sound of it. Okay, so The poet is Li Bai, 8th century Tang Dynasty, one of the great, if not the greatest poet. 将进酒，君不见，黄河之水天上来，奔流到海不复回。君不见，高堂明镜悲白发，照入青丝暮成雪。人生得意须尽欢，莫使金樽空对月。天生我材必有用，千金散尽还复来。And there we are. That's just a random selection.
That was great to listen to. The music I use as the outro for this podcast is a song. It's called 再见 Jacka, which is referring to Goodbye Jack Kerouac. It's by a band called Tongyang from Beijing. And on that album, they're kind of, the band itself's moving away from, what would you call it, like turn of the millennium alt metal to more like kind of drawing back into like Chinese folk or poetry traditions. And actually you sounded a little bit like the singer on some of the songs where he's going for a more poetic sound than just singing a rock song.
I sounded a bit like Yang Lian as well.
I was going to say that as well, yeah.
If you touch pitch, you shall be defiled therewith.
So how would you like to do this? Would you like to read all of Bring the Bevy Ben? Or would you like to do verse by verse?
That'd be verse by verse, couplet by couplet.
Okay.
That would be easier for the listener. Right?
Okay, and I'll preface this all by saying poetry is not really my area of expertise, so I'll just do my best.
Just very colloquial, be natural. Just like you're on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Bring the bevy Ben, which is?
Bring in the booze.
Oh, sirs, have you no seen the muckle yelly witter gae round into the sea, coming back never?
Oh, sirs, have you never seen the great yellow river go rolling down to the sea, coming back never?
Oh, sirs, have you no seen the keeking glasses in the Brecht Hall ruin this morning's jet black hair that's new as white as snow?
Oh, sirs, have you never seen the mirrors in the bright hall ruining this morning's black hair that's now as white as snow?
In this life, gin right vogie ye would be, man, dinna lee your gowden tassie, Tim a blow them in.
In this life, if you do it stylishly, man, don't leave your golden goblet empty beneath the moon.
I used my high engine for heav'n a bin. Thousands in gowd I've spent that'll no come back sin.
I use my great intelligence from heaven above. Thousands in gold I've spent that won't come back soon.
Roast ye yows and slaughtered out for grand fun. It'll take 300 rams to make the ye sederant.
Roast ewes and slaughter cattle for big fun. I'll take 300 glasses to make one proper sitting.
Be ye auld buddoch or be ye bold callant, bring the bevy Ben and keep it coming.
Be you old geezer, or be you bold young gallant, bring in the booze and keep it coming.
I'll sing ye a song, sirs, and it please ye. Say lend us your lugs and tak 10 to me.
I'll sing you a song, sirs, if it pleases you, so lend me your ears and take notice of me.
What's the avail, your utter fine quaich, your gemstain? All ye want's to be forever fou and ne'er be fresh again.
What's your precious silver cups, your gemstones worth? All you want is to be forever sloshed and never sober again.
The lang-syne saints and sages were torn-faced, ilka yin. For by the drinkers there nae others left a good name.
Saints and sages on the past were glum and gloomy every one, except for the drinkers, no others left behind a good name.
The King of Trin ranted through the peaceful pleasance, reed wood for pleasure, pouring drams by the millions.
The King of Chen ranted through the peaceful pleasance, pure mad for pleasure, pouring drinks by the millions.
Good man, what do we mean you're short the cellar? I'll get a rune in, sir, and drink with ye instanter.
Landlord, what do you mean you're short of money? I'll buy you a round and drink with you right away.
My piet naggy, my costly sable coatie, gar the boy, lay them in wad for a swally. And together we'll gar lang ages a dule, sant clean awa.
My brindled horse, my costly sable mantle, Get the boy to pawn them for a few drinks, and together we'll make long ages of woe vanish clean away.
Oh, very good. Well
That was
done,
fun.
you. That was good.
Yeah, I was actually, another thing I meant to say when I was saying about how it was a bit of an eye-opener for me editing Scots / trying to standardize its spelling, however futile or not that is, how much more I understood your poems in Stun in My Lane when I was reading them aloud, befuddling my English girlfriend,
Yep.
rather than just trying to read them in my head.
Yeah. Well, you see, that's it. We're speakers, but we're illiterate, essentially. Literacy involves reading in your head.
Yeah.
Right. Next.
Yep. Okay. So we've got some miscellaneous questions, some odds and ends. So we've a few Chinese vocab words have popped up. Monglong was the one that stuck in my head. I was wondering, as a thing I try to do on every episode and occasionally forget, is a Chinese word of the day for listeners, whether they are amazing at Chinese or whether they barely know a few words. I think it's a fun thing. So could you suggest a Mandarin Chinese word of the day, and maybe one that young Lian would pair with nicely?
Well, it relates to Yang Lian in that it's part of a concept that is absolutely absent in Western culture.
Perfect.
Well, until there was cross-fertilization, of course.
Right.
But if you write a man and put that behind the glyph for a mountain, you get in classical Chinese xian, or modern Chinese xianren, a xian person. Now, Chinese people will insist on translating xian as fairy.
Right.
It's not. Absolutely not. Fairies were a separate order of creation. To think that works is to completely misunderstand the function, history, and structure of fairies in Western culture.
Right.
There were 3 orders of creation: angels, humans, and fairies. Now, xianren are human. Now, xianren, excuse me, I'm quoting from Paul Kroll's Student's Dictionary of Classical and Medieval Chinese. It's a great definition. Okay. It's a Taoist term, a transcendent being, one who has moved beyond the needs and limits of the mundane world into the realm of spiritualization or divinity. Though extraordinarily long-lived, a xian is not immortal. So, how do you become xian? Excuse me. Xianren. It's about the Taoist thing of immersing yourself in the natural flow of things, doing nothing unnatural, becoming one with everything around you, with the 10,000 phenomena. And you do that through meditation exercises, through Tai Chi, things like the Tai Chi, exercises, meditation, living in the mountains, because the Qi, the energy, the vital energy, Qi, is what makes dead things different from living things. Living things have it. Right. Dead things don't. But you live in the mountains because the Qi is stronger there. And you live your life with this end point of purification. You may grow wings. That's unlikely nowadays, but 2,000 years ago, they thought it might be possible. You may end up living on a diet of spring water and pine nuts, because that's perfect purity. And it suited the Yang Lian because Yang Lian dives deep into his own culture, like fishing for pearls, and he brings up these strange, monstrous things from the deep, or they're strange and monstrous to me, because I don't dive in these waters. And that's a perfect example of a near untranslatable concept, xianren. Right. Conventionally, it's been translated as immortal, but as Kroll points out, these guys aren't immortal. They may be transcendent, they may be perfected, but they're human. It's just the same thing, like the Buddha, the Lord Buddha Gautama was a human. He wasn't a god, didn't become a god. He just showed us the pathway by which humans can become who they really are.
Now,
it's part of the same thing.
Yeah, I know we're trying to avoid rambling and going on tangents, but when you were saying about the mistranslation of xian to fairy, this is something that really caught my attention when I did an episode on San Mao's Stories of the Sahara, Sahala de Gusha, which has recently been brought out to English by Mike Fu, who was a guest on that episode, for listeners who want to check that out. And I asked him about Bician, pen spirit, or as I was introduced to it, pen fairy, although I was pretty aware fairy was not the exact right word. But the fact that it wasn't the right word made it more interesting to me, because it sounded, I don't know, it just really caught my little imagination.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
It's like Yang Lian talks about Ezra Pound's translations. He talks about Pound's magnificent mistakes.
Right.
Sometimes mistranslations can be much more fertile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it caught my attention much more than the listener who was telling me about it. Basically, BCN, pen fairy, something a little bit like, it's like a Chinese equivalent or parallel to Ouija board. And there was a thing fans of San Mao did where they tried to speak to her or her husband Jose through the pen fairy, the spirit pen. But I could go on and on about that. But just to say, it's nice to see Xian from BCN coming back to the podcast. And the other thing I was going to say is, I had a neighbor who lived next to my mum who lived to 105 and was one of the most lovely, chilled out guys I ever knew. He was just a fellow Dundonian, but the correct description you were giving me there of a transcended Xianren sounds a lot like my neighbor Alf. So yeah.
And just a final point before we move on. In these days of lockdown, do we need the Ouija board to talk to people in Glasgow?
That's what I've been doing. Don't know about you.
Right, next, moving on.
Okay, so maybe this relates a little bit to the word of the day. And again, this is totally an indulgent rambling question. So when I was doing the Moss Flow, not Moss Flow episode,
good man. Thanks, my boy.
I'm learning, always a student. I was trying to learn a little bit about yourself through the internet. I think it was through YouTube I learned about the existence of the Kagyu, sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, the Kagyu Samye Tibetan Buddhist Monastery. I think because there was a video of you and Yang Lian paying tribute to your brother Harvey, and the same account had some videos of this monastery. And there's, maybe I'm drawing connections where they aren't there, but there's a picture of yourself on the back of Stoneham Lane, and it looks like you might be somewhere a bit like that. I don't know if you're sat in the monastery.
Well, no. Although I know Samye Ling very well.
Right.
But that photograph was taken in West China, Sichuan province, in an area which Zhouzhaigo, it's a, what they call it, UNESCO thing. Protected area.
Right.
But, it used to be Tibet, but they withdrew. They redrew the boundaries. That was taken there. But no, Samye Ling, I went up there first in 1967, I think.
Right. It's quite old.
Yeah. Well, these were the first two. There were two monks sent to London in the early 60s from Tibet, because there is a prophecy that, or there was long ago. There's a prophecy that Buddhism would decline in Tibet but flourish in the West.
Interesting.
Where it lands to the west, So two guys landed up in Akong Rinpoche and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. They ended up in London, and they met a family who had inherited a house and land in near Eskdalemuir, up the top of the Southern Uplands, which is the wettest parish in Scotland, incidentally.
Oh no.
Yes. And the family said, well, we've got no use for it. You take it. So they set up a monastery there. And they've since built their own, they've built, as you drive up the hill, winding road through the forestry plantations, you come round the corner, and above the spruces, there is this Tibetan tower with upturned leaves and the eyes painted on it.
That's amazing.
It is. It's astonishing. It's a lovely place. It's a very important centre for the Dharma, of course, but also for Tibetan painting and Tibetan medicine. It's a worldwide importance.
Right.
And it's not easy to get to. From Melrose, it would be probably about an hour and a half, I would think, drive. It's the heart of the Southern Uplands. The parish of Eskdalemuir first comes on record in Melrose Abbey, early 12th century rent rolls from Melrose Abbey, which the land up there belonged to the abbey. So it's interesting. The first record is monastic, and 1,000 years later, there's another monastic thing going on up there.
Right, I guess
it's a lovely place. And when this lockdown is over, I would recommend that you come down and we'll take a jaunt.
Yeah, I would take you up on that, I think. Yeah, fantastic.
And here's a funny little story.
Yeah, you like those?
I was some years ago, 5-6 years ago, I applied for and got a residency in the Vermont Studio Centre. It was a scholarship that ran for a few years that paid for Chinese poets and translators to come and work together for a month.
I think this is where the poet Juju went, the one I mentioned earlier.
Yes. Yeah. Apparently the money has run out.
Oh.
But the first time I did it, Yang Lian, we were going to go together. And Yang said, I said, have you done it yet? Have you applied yet? No, because he had to apply. No, I'm busy with this. I'll do it next. And the deadline got nearer and nearer. I said, listen, do it. You'll get this. Just do it. Oh, well, it's all right. And then the deadline's coming close. They said, no, it's all right. They'll take a late application. And I actually cut and pasted from the website, we do not accept late applications. Oh. And he emailed me back, but they'll take one from me. Because I'm so famous and wonderful, And of course they didn't. So I landed up without a poet. And it happened there was a Chinese poet who didn't read the rules. Chinese people never read the instructions,
I noticed that when I was living there.
You remember Trabudo?
Trabudo, yep, right.
Near enough. It's near enough. Mm-hmm. They're like the Irish, sure, it'll be fine. Yeah. So they ended up with a loose translator, a loose poet. They turned out to be a lovely man. His name just escapes me, but we went into the guy who founded the place was retired from running it, but he had a painter, a big studio, and he invited us to his studio after lunch one day, and we got in, and it was a barn, basically, and right from the length of it, which must be about 30 feet away. What's his name? Anyway, the poet roared out, "Look, that's my guru." He didn't speak any English, so I had to translate this. And there was a picture of Chogyam Trungpa, one of the founders of Samye Ling. Oh. Who it turned out, after a few years at Eskdale Muir, they were left, an American gave them some land in Vermont, not 20 miles away from where we were. And the painter had studied meditation with this guy, and the poet had known him when he was in Tibet. So we had this odd link-up.
Right.
I knew this about 3 weeks before Akong Rinpoche, who the co-founder, was murdered. He was taking a large sum of money for his charity to Tibet, and he was killed in a hotel room in Sichuan.
Jesus.
Well, I mean, Tibetans, some people allege that it was the secret police that did it, but we'll never know.
Right.
So, we had this, because I knew Akong Rinpoche. So there were the three of us standing there in America with a strange connection through Samye Ling.
Well, that's funny. I just Googled Juju and Dong Li, the poet and translator that I did on the show. And yeah, sure enough, it was the exact same studio. So
Vermont Studio Centre, lovely place. Place.
So we've come full circle in a way there.
We have indeed, yes.
Yeah.
So, next question.
So these are the last few questions.
Because I'm getting hungry. I want to make my lunch.
Well, now you've incepted that idea in my head. Now I'm thinking about a sandwich.
I was thinking about baking an onion or something. Nice. Let's move on.
So a little self-promo moment. Are you working on any of your own projects just now in lockdown? And are there any other works or platforms already out there you'd like to take the opportunity to promote and point the listeners towards?
Well, there's right at the moment, I am just finishing off a book proposal for a very, very big project. I can't tell you more than that, but it's a very big publisher. It's very prestigious. It'll be 4 years of work. Gosh. It's the complete works of a Chinese poet, a classical one. Right. So I'm writing the book proposal for that. I'm still just finishing off the latest. Yang is now, a few years ago, I said to Yang, we were having a drink, we'd been doing a reading, and I said, are you finished the new book? He said, no. I said, well, don't wait until you finish it, because if you wait till you finish it, you send it to me, it takes me 2-3 years to translate it. Why don't you send it in installments? And he went, oh, what a good idea. So I've had the latest installments. I've had about 20 poems. Just about finished doing that. And then I don't know what, maybe he'll send me some more. And in recent months, I've been actually quite concentrating a lot. I've been doing a fair bit of translation of classical poetry, the poet called Bai Jui, Tang poet, which is not ready for publication. But I've also been recording my first solo album.
Oh, cool.
Which is Border Songs and Tunes. It's stalled, not just with lockdown, but other things have been happening. It's stalled like 99% done, just the final mastering to be done. And
right.
So I'm hoping that, I don't know what's going to happen with the lockdown and everything, but that's a big thing for me. I'm very pleased to do that.
Right. Well,
so look out for, it's going to be called Hassan's Dream.
Hassan's Dream.
Yes.
Okay. I do a little news segment at the start of every episode, so I'll keep an eye out for those. Or if you want to get it on the news segment, zap me an email and I'll make sure any of those, even if it's the album, doesn't matter if it's not anything to do with Chinese, you're a former guest of the show, so I gladly stick that in the news for the listeners who are interested.
Thank you very much. So I have Glancy in the land of podcasts then.
There you go. Yeah. The first of many packets or whatever measurements you use to measure Guanxi.
Yeah. Buckets.
Your first bucket of podcast Guanxi.
A pale fair Guanxi, please. A pun and a half.
That'll do it. Yeah. Pun at a Guanxi. I should try and translate some Dundonian into Chinese or vice versa. That would be funny. I did find a guy on a Dundonian on WeChat, and we were messing. He was very fluent in Chinese, and we're having fun rendering like modern Scots, mostly rude words as Chinese characters, but I won't repeat any of that on the show. It was "Oh yeah, dober," "Oh yeah, dwoba," or something.
Yeah. Oh yes, you can have fun. It's called. I mean, there's a verse form for that. It's called macaronics, where you write a poem in different languages. So it's very similar. But yes, and vulgarity is always a good thing.
Yes.
I'm always for that.
Yeah. So a couple more rounding off questions. If listeners read narrative poem, or if they just enjoyed your reading of Beijing opera, where else would you point them? And it could be any book. It doesn't have to be anything related to Chinese.
Well, of course, I think I can't. I've actually lost count. I think I've done 19 books with Yang Lian, so there's plenty of Yang Lian there.
Yeah.
For the wider contemporary music scene, poetry scene in China, 2012, I think, the Blood Axe anthology, Jade Ladder.
Oh, yeah.
I was translation editor, but Jade Ladder. Jade Ladder is a good spread of in translation of what was being written 10 years ago.
Right, Jade Ladder. Okay, that is where our listeners can find more modern Chinese poetry.
And in terms of Scots, just read everything. Oh, thanks.
Absolutely. And last question, a wee fun one. What are you reading just now?
Well, I've usually got a few things on the go. There's that novel, the first novel by Guy Airdrie called The Young Team. I've forgotten his name. I've been dipping into that. It's a novel in kind of Scots, kind of like a new generation, train spotting for a new generation.
The Young Team. Graham Armstrong?
That's the fella. Graham Armstrong's Young Team. I've been dipping in and out of Don Patterson's anthology, The Zoo of the New.
My dad gave me a book of his when I went off to China, so I wouldn't miss Dundee.
Patterson. Oh, I've kent Patterson for a long time. He's some boy.
Yeah.
He's a devil as a guitar player, you know. I mean, he plays jigs and reels in 3-part harmony. Never mind Patterson for just a book I would recommend, though, is the collected poems of Michael Donaghy.
Right.
Edited by Sean O'Brien, which has been out for a few years now, but I hung around in London with Patterson and Donaghy. Donaghy was a wonderful poet, awful nice man, died far too young. So I'm reading that, and then I'm also reading Wolf Hall.
Oh, yeah.
I managed to miss Wolf Hall when it came out, and I watched it on telly and thought, this is wonderful. So I'm reading my way through the whole trilogy.
Oh, when it came out on TV, my dad said I was watching Game of Thrones, and my dad was being an awful snob and saying, "Oh, it just seems the same way he is about Harry Potter," just sneering at it. He's like, "You should watch Wolf Hall. It's like Game of Thrones, but real history." And I was like, "Okay, whatever," and then blanked it. But I've heard it's really good, so I should get over my parental issues and check it out. Yeah.
I mean, yes, of course, I was blown away by Game of Thrones as well. I never thought I would see a fantasy series, so much money put into it. But of course, the Lord of the Rings films were the kickoff for that. If it hadn't been for Jackson and the Lord of the Rings, then you would never have Game of Thrones.
No.
I read some of the Game of Thrones books, and he'll keep you turning the pages, but he's not a great writer.
Yeah, it's for the story and the characters, I guess.
Yeah. I thought the TV stuff. I didn't actually see the last. I disconnected my telly, and I heard such bad reviews of the final series of Game of Thrones, I didn't bother.
I liked it, but I liked the end of Lost as well. I'm pretty convinced that the critics are wrong. But yeah, anyway, before we start just talking about Game of Thrones for another hour, I should probably just say thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. I mean, hopefully we can do this again. There's a lot more we could talk about. Absolutely. And also that we can meet in real life with a refreshing beverage.
Nice wee bevy, yeah.
Yes,
that would be great.
A refreshing beverage once all of this nonsense is over.
Yeah, a nice glass of Corona, maybe.
Well, stay wheel.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean stay sober.
Well, that's the end of my chat with Brian, and we're approaching the end of the show. I think that was absolutely very fun. That's a very poorly phrased sentiment. I think it was an absolutely great chat. That's what I can say. So if you enjoyed the show, here's what you can do to give some feedback or just to follow our social media platforms. The Twitter for the show is just my own semi-professional one. It's at Angus Likes Words. I'll tweet lots of stuff about translated Chinese fiction and occasionally just my own thoughts or my own ramblings, but generally speaking, it's about the stuff I talk about on the show that you'll see there on the Twitter. It's a great place to talk either in a little public tweet as a reply or mention or whatever. Also, the Twitter DMs are there and I reply to those pretty fast. Instagram, this show has an Instagram account dedicated entirely to the show and not to my inane, ridiculous life, and you can follow it at TrChFic, TrChFic. Now, something I do on Twitter these days is I try to make group chats for pretty much each episode, and I'm going to, just after I finish putting this episode together, I'm going to try and assemble people to make a Yang Lian group, or I think I'm going to actually make it a Misty Poets group, just to catch all, so to speak. So if you'd like to join a Misty Poets group, just follow that Instagram, zap me a message, and provided I can get more than 2 people, so me plus one, I can make a group chat, and then we can continue to add people to that wherever, whenever. We also already have a Chinese sci-fi group chat, a Sanmao group chat, and a Moyan group chat. So again, if you want to be added to those, contact that Instagram account and i.e. me, will give you an invite. There is a Facebook presence for this show too. That is a way to get in touch. There's a page, just search for the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast, and if you search in the groups, we have a discussion group for the show. It's pretty much dead, but if you post there, at the very least I will respond to you, but hopefully some other listeners might too. Now, another thing I'd like to plug is Himalaya. So I upload these episodes to SoundCloud, and that then the feed is tracked to pretty much all the other worldwide podcast providers. But for the benefit of people listening inside the PRC, where my host SoundCloud is blocked, and therefore all other access to the show is blocked, inaccessible without a VPN, I've also uploaded it, or I also upload every episode to a Chinese podcasting platform called Himalaya. So there'll be a link for that. I'll tweet. But if you need the link for the show on Himalaya because you can't find it yourself and you want to listen inside China easily with no VPN or share it to friends there, no problem. I'll send it to you. consider it done. So that's the platforms. Now let's talk paying me money. If you want to materially support the show, which is by no means obligatory, and I deliberately made that sound aggressive, there's 2 places you can do it. There's Patreon, which, if you don't know, that's a place where you can give like a monthly contribution. There are hours of bonus material up there, which if you're a contributor, you get access to. I just uploaded one recently, a little ramble about Guofei's Flock of Brown Birds, and I've got a few more kind of backlog that I'm going to add roughly every week. I don't know if that'll be a habit, but I do know for the next few weeks there will be new content up on the Patreon. If you are a bit intimidated by the idea of a regular donation that just keeps paying me money automatically and you'd rather give a one-off one, good news, there's a website called Buy Me a Coffee where you can just give a one-off contribution. So I will put the links to both those places on the show notes, but basically patreon.com/TrChFic, TrChFic, and the other one, buymeacoffee.com/TrChFic, TrChFic. But you know what? There are more important things than money, and there are better ways of spreading the word about the show. And in my opinion, the best way to do that is by telling other people that you might think are interested. So tell your friends, tell your family, tell your colleagues, tell your Makar, that is your Scottish national poet, although you might struggle to do that if you're not Scottish. So in the absence of a Makar, tell your local Shenren, your local fairy person or transcended sage. And in the lack of either of those things, just contact the local secret Commonwealth of Elvis fans and tell them, and they really will get the word out. So just do all those things, and until next time, next episode, 再见.